late evening, the house is quiet. You've done what you do every night. Checked the phone one last time, set it face down on the nightstand. The day is finished. There is nothing left to do. You're lying in the dark when a phrase surfaces, not a thought you chose, not something you were reaching for, something that arrived from somewhere below conscious awareness, the way a dream image arrives before you're fully asleep. At the time of the end, you lie still. You don't know what triggered it. You can't trace it to anything you read today, or heard, or saw. You've known this phrase since childhood. It is part of the furniture of your interior world, one of those inherited phrases that arrived before you could evaluate it, before you could ask where it came from or what it meant. At the time of the end, it's from Daniel, chapter 12, verse 4. You know this the way you know a hymn. You know the words before you know the source. Seal up the book. Until the time of the end. You don't look it up. You tell yourself it's nothing. The random output of a tired mind at the end of an ordinary day. But it stays there in the dark with you. Not anxious, not frightening, just present. Like something knocking from the inside of a door that has been sealed a long time. By the end of this video, you'll understand why it keeps coming back. There was a journalism assignment I accepted in 2008 and never filed. The task was specific. Document how institutional prophecy calculation works across centuries. Trace the Daniel formula from its earliest interpreters to its most recent applications. Produce something a general reader could follow. I thought it would take 6 weeks. 8 months later, I had not written a word. My name is Nathan, former high school history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school teaching world history and early Christianity. I resigned when the evidence kept leading me somewhere the institution was not prepared to follow. The piece never became a story, it became a wall, literally. I cleared one wall of my office and began pinning things to it in chronological order. Jerome, 407 of the Common Era. A scholar commissioned by the Church to write a full commentary on Daniel, not for devotion, but to refute a philosopher who had argued the book wasn't what the institution claimed. Jerome did the calculation. He identified the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 as prophecy pointing forward. He published it as doctrine. Thomas Aquinas, approximately 1252, referenced Daniel's formula in the Summa Theologiae as evidence of prophetic precision, did not extend the calculation forward, left the formula intact. Isaac Newton, 1697 through 1704, private manuscripts, Cambridge. He applied Daniel's formula to a specific question: when does the prophetic timeline complete? He circled his answer, wrote the number twice. John Nelson Darby, 1830, Plymouth, England. A clergyman who invented what is now called the gap theory. The doctrine that the 69 weeks of Daniel 9 ended with Jesus' triumphal entry, and that the 70th week was suspended, still future, waiting to begin. His innovation is now so embedded in American evangelical theology that most readers do not know it was created by a single man in 1830. Cyrus Ingerson Scofield, 1909. The Scofield Reference Bible. He embedded Darby's interpretation in the footnotes of a Bible edition that sold 5 million copies. The distinction between scripture and commentary dissolved on the page. Hal Lindsey, 1970. The late great planet Earth. He applied the formula to the modern state of Israel, calculated the generation clock from Matthew 24, and predicted the second coming before 1988. 28 million copies sold. 1988 arrived. No public acknowledgement. Harold Camping, 1994, then 2011, specific dates each time, no acknowledgement when each date passed, hundreds of YouTube channels, 2014 through 2024, the same formula, updated starting points, new windows. I had pinned every major application of Daniel's calculation I could find to this wall. The dates that had passed outnumbered the dates that had not, and not one of these sources had ever publicly acknowledged that their predecessor's window had expired. Not one of them said the previous calculation was wrong. That is a different problem. What they said, each one in succession, was the formula is correct. The starting date was different. We have the right starting date now. I looked at the wall for a long time. I was not looking at evidence that Daniel's formula fails. I was looking at evidence that the formula never stops. What changes generation by generation is only the starting date. I wrote at the top of the wall in red marker, "We are in 2026, inside the most cited prophetic generation window in evangelical history." I never filed the piece. The wall is still there. Let me show you what the formula actually is, because the title of this investigation promises a specific calculation. I want to show you the mechanism, not tell you what to believe about it, but show you how it works. How it has worked in the hands of serious interpreters for 1600 years. Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27. 4 verses. The most mathematically specific passage in the entire prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible. They introduce the concept of 70 weeks. In Hebrew, Shavuim. The word is literally sevens, could mean 7 days or 7 years. Every major interpreter from Jerome forward has read it as 7 years. 70 sevens of years, 490 years total. The passage divides those years into segments, 7 sevens plus 62 sevens, 69 sevens, which is 483 years. From a specific starting event, a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, to the arrival of what the passage calls the Anointed One. 1 week remains, the 70th, set apart, described separately. Sir Robert Anderson, a British civil servant and detective novelist, worked out the most influential modern calculation in 1894 in a book called The Coming Prince. His starting point, Artaxerxes the Bestwise issued a decree authorizing Nehemiah to rebuild Jerusalem. The historical date, March 14th, 445 before the Common Era. 69 weeks of years calculated on the prophetic calendar of 360 days per year rather than the solar calendar. 173,880 days from March 14, 445 BCE, 173,880 days, forward lands on April 6, 32 of the Common Era. The triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. Anderson claimed this to within what he considered a remarkable degree of precision. Evangelical scholarship has largely treated it as remarkable for more than a century. The 70th week of the remaining 7 years is suspended, still future. This is the gap that Darby invented. What happens during it? The tribulation. What triggers it? A specific covenant. What ends it? The figure described in Daniel 9:27. That is the structure. I am not telling you it is correct. I am telling you this is what is applied generation by generation to new starting points. And the starting point that modern futurist interpreters use, the one that generates the window we are currently inside, is May 14th, 1948, the founding of the modern state of Israel. The generation clock from Matthew 24:34, combined with the lifespan from Psalm 90:10, produces a maximum of 80 years from that date, 1948 plus 80 2028, we are in 2026. The formula is not publicly retired. The calculation has not been acknowledged as failed. The institution running it has gone quiet, and we are inside its current window. You remember the first time an adult told you the end was coming soon. They said it with certainty, not the anxious certainty of someone guessing, the certainty of someone who had read the passages, consulted the timeline, and reached a conclusion they trusted. They may have named a year or a decade, or they may have said, in your lifetime, before this generation passes. And then the date came, or the decade closed, or the generation that was not supposed to pass, passed. And you were in church the Sunday after. The altar flowers were fresh. The hymns were normal. The offering plates came around. Nobody mentioned it, not in the service, not in the fellowship hall afterward, not in the adult Sunday school class that had been 3 months earlier studying these exact passages. You were young enough to notice the silence and old enough to understand what it meant. Something had been wrong with the calculation. Nobody said so. The following Sunday was ordinary. That is the version of no one knows you grew up with, not the theological version, the humble, printed in the catechism acknowledgement that the precise moment belongs to God alone. That version was taught on Sunday mornings with appropriate reverence. The version you grew up with was institutional. The version that says the formula was running, the window arrived, nothing happened, the congregation absorbed it without acknowledgement. And somewhere, in a seminary library, in a commentary footnote, in the notes of a Bible with 5 million copies in circulation, the formula was quietly updated with a new starting date. What you were experiencing in that silent Sunday was not spiritual doubt. It was accurate observation. The Cambridge University Library holds approximately 3 million words of Isaac Newton's private theological manuscripts. 3 million words. For comparison, the complete works of Shakespeare total approximately 880,000 words. The King James Bible approximately 780,000. Newton wrote nearly 4 times the complete works of Shakespeare in private theological notes he never intended to publish. Most of them are about Daniel. He began working on Daniel and Revelation in the 1670s, while he was simultaneously producing what would become the Principia Mathematica. He spent more cumulative years on prophetic chronology than on the laws of motion, more intellectual labor on the book of Daniel than on gravity. His published scientific work made him the most celebrated mind in Europe. His private theological work, roughly 1,700 pages on Daniel alone, remained unknown until after his death. It was auctioned at Sotheby's in 1936. John Maynard Keynes bought a significant portion of the lot. Keynes read what Newton had written. He gave a lecture on it in 1942 at Cambridge. He said, Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians. What Keynes meant, the man who explained the motion of the planet spent the second half of his life calculating when history would end. The specific calculation in Newton's private manuscripts, dated approximately 1704, works as follows. The 1260 years of Daniel 12:7, the time, times, and half a time during which the power of the holy people would be scattered. Newton read this as 1260 prophetic years from the moment the papacy achieved temporal institutional authority in the West. His starting date, 800 of the Common Era. The year Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. The moment the Church became a political institution with territorial sovereignty. 800 plus 1260. 2060. He wrote it in his private manuscripts. He circled it. He wrote it again, his explicit statement, preserved in the original handwriting, I see no reason for its ending sooner. Not prediction in the evangelical sense. Newton framed it as a lower bound, the earliest the prophetic timeline could complete, not the precise year it would. But he did the calculation, and he circled the number twice. The man who described the orbit of the moon, who laid the mathematical foundation for 3 centuries of physics, who solved problems that had resisted every prior mind in Europe, considered the Daniel calculation important enough to return to across decades of private work, and kept the result private. That is what I stayed with the first time I found this. Not whether Newton was right about 2060. The fact that he found the formula serious enough to spend decades on. The formula has been drawing serious minds for 1600 years. Not because it is obviously correct, because it is specifically designed to invite calculation. The numbers are precise, the starting events are historically anchored. The mechanism is clear enough to run, and everyone who runs it believes when they run it that this time the starting date is right. Newton believed it. He circled the number. He said, I see no reason for it ending sooner. He kept the paper private and went back to work. In approximately 270 to 305 of the Common Era, a philosopher named Porphyry of Tyre wrote a work called Against the Christians. 15 volumes. He was not a Christian. He was a Neoplatonist, a serious philosopher working in the tradition of Plato, writing in Greek, read across the Mediterranean world. His argument about Daniel was specific. He argued the book of Daniel was not written in the 6th century before the Common Era, as the text presents itself, not during the reign of Babylon, not during Persia or the early Greek Empire. Porphyry argued it was written during the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus ruled the Seleucid Empire from 175 to 164 before the Common Era. He desecrated the Jerusalem temple in 167 BCE. He banned Jewish religious practice. He erected an altar to Zeus in the temple. Porphyry's argument, the prophecies in Daniel, the 4 kingdoms, the abomination of desolation, the period of persecution, are not predictions of events that happened later. They are descriptions of events that were already unfolding when the text was composed. A Jewish author, writing during the crisis, embedded apparent predictions of outcomes that had already occurred to sustain a community under extreme pressure. This is what scholars call vaticinium ex eventu, prophecy from the event. Writing shaped to look like prediction when its actual referent is already history. Porphyry was not arguing that the Bible is worthless. He was making a historical literary argument about one specific document. The Church's response was to destroy his work. Theodosius II issued an imperial decree in 435 of the Common Era. Every copy of Porphyry's 15 volumes was to be burned. The books were burned. 13 years later, in 448, a second imperial decree, burned again, 2 separate burning orders, 13 years apart, the same 15 volumes. Jerome wrote his commentary on Daniel in 407 of the Common Era, the same Jerome I had placed at the top of my wall in Evansville, explicitly as the institutional response to Porphyry. His stated purpose in the introduction to refute Porphyry's argument. Commentary first, fire second, more fire third. Today, in secular biblical scholarship in university departments of religious studies and ancient Near Eastern studies, in the peer-reviewed journals of the Society of Biblical Literature, the consensus position on the dating of Daniel is Porphyry's position. The majority view among scholars who approach the text without theological commitment to predictive prophecy. Daniel was composed during the Maccabean period, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, using the literary device of historical prophecy to sustain a community under persecution. Airman at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. John J. Collins at Yale Divinity School. The standard introductions to the Old Testament in most secular seminaries. Porphyry was right. The most accurate ancient commentary on the Book of Daniel was written by a philosopher who engaged the text on its own historical terms. The Church destroyed it twice by imperial order. When a refutation requires hundreds of pages of formal commentary and 2 burning orders, it is worth asking what the institution was protecting. Here is something I did not know for the first 40 years of my life. The Book of Daniel is written in 2 languages, not translated from one into another. Written in 2 languages in the same manuscript, switching mid-sentence. Chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4, A. Hebrew. Chapter 2, verse 4, B through chapter 7, verse 28, Aramaic. Chapter 8 through chapter 12, back to Hebrew. No other book in the Hebrew Bible does this. Not partially in Aramaic, not in a different section, not as a composite document assembled from separate sources. The switch happens in the middle of chapter 2, verse 4. The Chaldeans begin to speak to Nebuchadnezzar, and the language of the narrative shifts to match their speech, and stays in Aramaic for 6 more chapters. I had read this in a footnote somewhere in my late 30s. I had noted it, filed it. I had not stayed with what it meant. When I went back to the wall, when I began to look at which sections were in which language, I saw what the division was. The Aramaic sections, chapters 2 through 7, are the publicly accessible narratives, Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great statue, the 4 world empires, Daniel in the lion's den, Belshazzar's feast, and the writing on the wall. These are the stories that became Sunday school lessons, paintings, allegories, cultural reference points accessible to anyone in the ancient Mediterranean world, because Aramaic was the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, the international language of commerce, diplomacy, and administration from approximately 700 before the Common Era through the 1st century of the Common Era. If you wrote in Aramaic, your text could travel. The Hebrew sections, chapters 1 and 8 through 12, contain something different. Chapter 12. At the time of the end, many who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. The specific day counts 1,290 days, 1,335 days. The resurrection passage. The sealed book. The calculations that serious interpreters from Jerome to Newton to Anderson to Scofield have regarded as pointing to a precise chronological moment. Those are in Hebrew, the restricted language, not rare. It was the language of liturgy and learning throughout the Second Temple period, but not the language of the marketplace, not the language of someone outside the community who picked up a text and read it. The writer of Daniel placed the publicly accessible narratives in the language most people could access, and placed the most chronologically specific calculations in the language that required specialized training, not burned, not hidden in a vault, written in a different language inside the same book. The most sensitive calculation was there the whole time, above most readers' reach. You have had a Bible in your house your whole life. Or the app, the same words on a different surface. The book of Daniel is in it. You may have read the lion's den, the handwriting on the wall, maybe chapter 9, if you were in a church that took prophecy seriously. But you were probably not told the book switches languages. You were probably not told that the chapters everyone knows are in Aramaic and the day count calculations are in Hebrew. You were probably not told that someone in writing this text made a decision about which readers would reach which passages, not because the text was sealed. The text has been in every copy of the scriptures since before Gutenberg, in every Bible on every nightstand in the Western world. What was managed was the layer beneath the text, the architectural decision. 2 languages in one book, one for the stories everyone could share, one for the calculations that the institution would spend 1,600 years applying in private and managing in public. The most sensitive map was written in a language most readers could not access, and placed in the same book as the stories they already knew. It required no fire. It required only the right language and the right training, which the institution controlled. When the first scrolls were recovered from Cave 1 at Qumran in 1947, the initial identification was of Isaiah, the great Isaiah scroll, the most complete ancient manuscript of any biblical book, written approximately 125 years before the Common Era. That scroll is now in the shrine of the book in Jerusalem. You can see it. But over the following decade, as excavations continued through 11 caves above the Dead Sea, a pattern emerged that most popular accounts of the Dead Sea Scrolls do not emphasize. The community that preserved these scrolls had a specific relationship with Daniel. 11 Daniel manuscripts were recovered from the caves. 11. More copies of Daniel at Qumran than of most books currently inside the biblical canon. More than Deuteronomy, more than Numbers, more than the majority of the prophets. This was not a community of casual readers. They read with a technique they called pesha, from a Hebrew word meaning solution or interpretation. Pesha was a specific hermeneutical method. Take a prophetic text and read it as applying directly to the events of your own time, not as ancient history, not as distant future, as now, as speaking to this generation in this crisis, in this moment. The documents designated 4Q pseudo-Daniel A and 4Q pseudo-Daniel B, found in Cave 4, classified in scholarship as pseudo-Danielic texts, show the community actively applying Daniel's framework to their own historical situation. They were reading Daniel as pointing to them, as describing a moment they were positioned to witness. They sealed the scrolls in ceramic jars and placed them in limestone caves, sometime around 68 of the Common Era, as the Roman legions approached, because they believed what they were preserving was too important to lose. What the Pesha method tells us, application of Daniel's formula to the present moment, is not a modern evangelical innovation. It is not Darby or Scofield or Hal Lindsey. It goes back to the 1st century before the Common Era. The community at Qumran was doing what Jerome would do 4 centuries later, what Aquinas would do 8 centuries after that, what Newton would do in private across 1,700 pages of unpublished manuscript. Every serious generation of Daniel readers has concluded, through their own application of the formula, that the text is speaking to them. That is not evidence the formula fails. It is evidence of how the formula was designed. The text generates new applications. We are a generation reading it. In 2026, Benitez has spent 40 years investigating the historical Jesus. His Caballo de Troya series, 10 volumes published between 1984 and 2016, is structured around 1st century Jerusalem. The events of Genesis 6 are far outside his narrative frame. The prophecies of Daniel 9 are not his primary subject, but he writes about Jesus, and Jesus had something specific to say about Daniel. In the Gospels, the phrase Son of Man appears approximately 80 times. 80. It is the phrase Jesus uses more than any other to describe himself, more than rabbi, more than teacher, more frequently than any other self-designation in the canonical record. Where does it come from? Daniel 7 verses 13 and 14. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. He came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, the Danielic Son of Man. The figure who approaches the divine throne on clouds and receives universal authority. Jesus quotes or alludes to this image in Mark 13, in Matthew 24, in Luke 21, the apocalyptic discourses that sit at the center of the gospel narrative. He invokes it at his trial before the Sanhedrin, where the high priest tears his garments not at a claim of divinity in abstract, but at the specific citation of Daniel's cloud rider. He is not using it as metaphor. In the theology of Second Temple Judaism, the Danielic Son of Man is a specific eschatological figure, a figure whose arrival marks the end of the age as it currently operates. When Jesus says Son of Man 80 times across every gospel, he is positioning himself within Daniel's framework. He is saying, I am the figure Daniel described. He is not moving away from the apocalyptic reading of Daniel. He is inhabiting it. Benitez, across his series and in interviews spanning 4 decades of public work, returns repeatedly to this observation. The most consistent suppression in the Church's presentation of Jesus is the suppression of the apocalyptic Jesus. The Jesus who sat with his disciples on the Mount of Olives and described in specific terms what the end of the age would look like. The Jesus who cited Daniel explicitly, who spoke of the abomination of desolation, who invoked the Son of Man coming on clouds with the holy angels, that Jesus was not comfortable for an institution that needed to sustain itself across centuries, an institution with buildings to maintain, hierarchies to protect, and temporal authority to preserve, has limited use for a Jesus who says the present order will not outlast the current generation. So the institutional presentation of Jesus was adjusted, not by removing the texts, with the words are still there, in every Bible printed since Gutenberg, by adjusting the frame. This generation refers to humanity generally. The time of the end is a spiritual category. The Son of Man is a metaphor for humble humanity. And Daniel's formula, which Jesus himself cited, which Newton circled, which Scofield embedded in 5 million Bibles, was managed out of the Sunday sermon series. It stayed in the footnotes, it stayed in the commentaries, it stayed on the wall in my office in Evansville, and it kept running. I want to be precise about what being inside the window actually means, because I have had that wall for 16 years. I have watched what happens when a prophetic window arrives and passes, and I want to show you exactly where we are, and what the institution is doing with it. The dominant modern futurist application of Daniel 9, embedded in the footnotes of 5 million Scofield Bibles, popularized by Hal Lindsey in 1970, still anchoring evangelical prophecy teaching in 2026, uses one starting date: May 14, 1948. The founding of the modern state of Israel. The generation clock is pulled from Matthew 24, verse 34. This generation will not pass away until all these things occur. The lifespan from which the generation is measured comes from Psalm 90, verse 10. The days of our years are 70 years, and, or if by strength, 80. 1948 plus 70, 2018. 2018 passed. The institutional response, silence. Not a retraction. Not a public acknowledgement. Not a revised framework. The previous window's expiration was absorbed without comment, and the calculation was updated. 80 years. 1948 plus 80, 2028. We are in 2026. Inside the window. Multiple independent applications of the formula, different scholars, different starting points within the generation framework, converge on this decade. The formula is not retired. The calculation is active. The institution has gone quiet. And its public position, unchanged since the Catechism was written, unchanged since the Councils, remains. No one knows the day or hour. These two things coexist. They have been coexisting for 1600 years. Jerome ran the calculation in 407 and embedded it in the theological tradition. Aquinas acknowledged the formula's precision without extending it. Newton circled a year and kept the paper private. Scofield put it in 5 million Bibles. The Catechism says, no one knows. That is not a contradiction. It is a policy. The calculation runs in the footnotes, in the prophecy conferences, in the seminaries, in the YouTube channels with millions of subscribers. The public position manages the institutional risk. If you say the formula points to 2026 and 2026 passes without event, you have a problem. If you say no one knows the day or hour, but the formula keeps running, you have managed the risk. That is it. That is the question. Not whether Daniel's formula is accurate, whether the institution that has been running it for 1600 years through Jerome and Aquinas and Newton and Scofield and Lindsay has ever once publicly acknowledged that its predecessor's window had expired. It hasn't. What changes generation by generation is only the starting date. What doesn't change is the formula. And the formula is pointing here, at 2026. We are the generation the current calculation produces. The phrase is still there from last night. At the time of the end, it came back this morning. During the drive-in, not connected to anything you had read or heard, just present the way it always is. You know where it's from now. Daniel 12, verse 4. Seal up the book until the time of the end, and knowledge shall increase. The formula is not sealed. Jerome opened it in 407 and embedded it in the Western theological tradition, in the same commentary written to refute the man whose books were burned twice. Newton circled a number in a manuscript he kept private across decades of careful work. Cambridge held it, Sotheby's auctioned it, Keynes bought it and read it, and called the greatest physicist in Western history the last of the magicians. Scofield put the calculation in 5 million Bibles. The wall in my office in Evansville has names on it going back 16 centuries. None of them are named Daniel. Every one of them believed they had found the right starting date. None of them ever publicly acknowledged that their predecessor's window had passed. The formula doesn't stop. What stops is the conversation about the formula. Whenever the previous window expires, and then the conversation begins again with a new starting date. And the institution says, no one knows the day or hour. And the footnotes say, here is the current window. And we are inside the window the current calculation produces. We are in 2026. The phrase you carried into sleep last night. The phrase that surfaced without a trigger, without anything you had done to summon it. It goes back to the same text that Newton spent more years on than gravity. The same text Porphyry argued with enough precision that 2 imperial burning orders were required to suppress his argument. The same text the Qumran community copied 11 times, applied to their own generation, and sealed in ceramic jars in limestone caves because they believed it was worth protecting. At the end of everything they knew, the formula has been running since 407. It is still running, and we are in the year the current calculation produces. I'll let you sit with that. This is Nathan, Forbidden Gospels.